Hello, everyone, and hi all. Welcome to BookPodCastZone. I'm Emma, and I'm really excited to be exploring today's topic with you.
And I'm John. It's great to be back diving into another really fascinating subject with all of you.
So today we are embarking on a pretty deep dive into an incredibly insightful work that just resonates so much, I think. Erich Fromm's The Art of Listening.
Mm-hmm.
Now, here's the interesting thing. This isn't a book Fromm sat down and wrote cover to cover in the traditional sense. It's actually a brilliant transcription. It captures his 1974 seminar in Locarno, Switzerland, and it's woven together with other talks he gave, spanning from 1964 all the way to 1980, the year he passed away.
Right, so it feels very immediate, very alive, almost like you're in the room.
Exactly. And our mission today is to take this stack of really profound insights from he was a true master of humanistic psychology, and pull out the most important nuggets of knowledge, the key insights for you. We'll be looking specifically at psychoanalytic therapy, but through his very unique humanistic lens, we'll emphasize the absolutely crucial role of listening, which is, the title of the work.
The core of it, yeah.
And then crucially, we're going to try and connect all that wisdom directly to our world, right here, right now, in 2025. How does it still apply?
And it's genuinely remarkable how relevant Fromm's ideas remain. I mean, they're so deeply rooted in concepts like self-knowledge, empathy, authenticity, things we're all still grappling with.
For sure.
They feel incredibly pertinent for anyone trying to navigate personal growth, relationships, just life, really, in today's complex world. So what we're going to do is unpack this incredible work chapter by chapter. We'll dig into it and hopefully reveal just how timeless and actually how actionable his observations really are.
Sounds like a plan. Let's dive into the first chapter then. Okay, so chapter 1. Fromm kicks things off with a pretty fundamental argument, doesn't he? He says the primary goal, the main aim of psychoanalysis, is simply to know oneself.
Yeah, straight out of the gate.
And he presents it not just as like a clinical objective for therapy, but as this timeless human aspiration, something people have been striving for, well, forever. It's this fundamental urge to look inward, to understand who you really are beneath the surface.
You've really hit on something important there, the way he frames it.
Yeah.
Because Fromm immediately does this brilliant thing where he grounds this seemingly modern psychoanalytic goal in ancient wisdom. He doesn't just invent it.
Right, he connects it back.
He draws this direct line, this thread from that famous ancient Greek dictum, know thyself, the one supposedly inscribed at the Temple of Apollo at Delphi. That wasn't just decoration. It signaled how profoundly important self-knowledge was to ancient thinkers like Socrates and Plato.
Mm-hmm. A cornerstone.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And Fromm doesn't stop there. He traces it forward through history, right into medieval thought. He specifically brings up Meister Eckhart.
Eckhart, the mystic.
That's the one. The influential 13th century German theologian, a Christian mystic. Fromm quotes Eckhart's really profound statement, "The only way of knowing God is to know oneself."
Wow. That's a heavy statement.
It is. And for Fromm, this isn't just, a nice spiritual metaphor. It's crucial. It underscores his idea that self-knowledge isn't just about personal improvement, like ticking off boxes on a self-help list. It's about connecting with something deeper, maybe even an existential truth about what it means to be human.
So it gives self-understanding this depth, almost a sacred quality.
Exactly. He's suggesting that unlocking your inner self, really digging deep, is actually a pathway to understanding universal truths, maybe even the nature of reality itself, or at least your own reality.
Yeah.
It elevates the whole pursuit beyond just fixing problems.
And Fromm's doesn't just stay in the philosophical realm, does he? He brings it right into the therapy room.
Yeah.
He argues that understanding your unconscious motivations, all that stuff bubbling under the surface, and also understanding those subtle, sometimes invisible societal influences that shape us.
Right.
That this is absolutely essential.
Right. Both aspects.
It's not just for personal growth generally, but specifically for therapy to actually work. He's pushing for this holistic view.
Right.
Why is that so critical? Why look at the whole picture of the unconscious and society, not just, say, the symptoms someone presents with?
That's a really critical point in Fromm's thinking, because he fundamentally believes we are profoundly shaped by both our internal world, those unconscious drives, fears, desires, conflicts we might not even be aware of, and the external social structures we live in, our families, our culture, our economic system, all of it.
So you can't really separate them.
Well, he argues you can't. Not if you want real understanding. He's arguing against this narrow, almost medical model focus on just individual pathology, just the symptoms. Think about it. Without understanding those deeply ingrained patterns in our unconscious, and also how society's norms, its values, its pressures are constantly influencing our behavior, our thoughts, our feelings. Well, therapy risks becoming superficial.
Like just trimming the weeds instead of pulling the roots.
Exactly like that. It's like trying to fix a car engine, as you said before, without looking at both the internal mechanics and the quality of the fuel it's running on, or even the road conditions it's driving on.
Yeah.
This holistic view means real healing, real growth, requires addressing the whole person within their lived context. It's about uncovering the roots, internal and external, not just pruning the leaves.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Then Fromm introduces something that I imagine must have really shaken things up back then. His emphasis on the therapeutic relationship itself. He says the analyst and the patient need to form a mutual reciprocal relationship, both learning from each other.
Oh, absolutely. This was revolutionary for its time.
How so? What was the standard model he was pushing against?
Well, think about the more traditional, early psychoanalytic models, especially stemming from Freud. Freud often positioned the analyst as a kind of blank slate, objective, detached, almost like a surgeon observing a patient. The analyst held the knowledge, the interpretations, the authority. It was quite hierarchical.
The expert and the patient.
Pretty much. Fromm completely turns this on its head. He redefines the analyst not as this all-knowing expert dispensing wisdom from on high, but as a co-learner, someone actively engaged in a shared journey of discovery alongside the patient.
A co-participant.
Precisely. And the implications for healing and insight are just immense. Imagine the difference for you as a patient. Instead of feeling analyzed or diagnosed by a distant figure, you feel genuinely seen, understood, and like your experience is being explored together.
It fosters trust, I guess.
Huge trust. And authenticity, collaboration.
Yeah.
When it happens, Fromm believed, it profoundly accelerates the process of self-discovery. It allows for deeper, more honest insights to emerge. Insights that really stick because they come from that shared experience. The analyst still brings their expertise, of course, their training, their framework.
Sure.
But the patient brings their unique, lived reality, their inner world. And the real wisdom, the real transformation happens at the intersection of those two subjective worlds. It's a dialogue, not a monologue.
That's a fascinating shift in the whole dynamic. It feels much more human. And you mentioned Fromm's background helps explain this blend of ideas.
Yes, absolutely. To really get Fromm, you need a bit of historical context. He was a German-American psychoanalyst, but he was also a key figure in the Frankfurt School.
A Frankfurt School,
Yeah.
critical theory, right. Adorno, Horkheimer.
Exactly those guys. They were renowned for their critical theory, which essentially looked at how society's power structures, its culture, its economy, influence individual psychology.
Yeah.
They blended Freudian psychoanalysis with Marxist social analysis. It's a potent mix.
Okay, so that explains the emphasis on society's influence.
It's vital. This background explains how Fromm uniquely blends these two seemingly separate fields, individual psychology and social critique. He didn't just blindly apply Freud's ideas, he actively critiqued them through this sociological lens.
He saw the limitations of focusing only inward.
Precisely. His integration means that for Fromm, self-knowledge is inherently intertwined with understanding societal influences. He believed you couldn't fully grasp individual psychological distress, neurosis, anxiety, alienation, without also understanding the social, economic, and cultural forces shaping that individual. He even talked about the possibility of a sick society, one that actively produces psychological suffering. It's a powerful critique of purely individualistic approaches to mental health.
And that must have really resonated in the 1970s when he was giving these talks.
Oh, definitely. The timing was perfect. The field of psychoanalysis itself was evolving, moving beyond some of the more rigid classical Freudian frameworks that had dominated for decades. People were questioning those deterministic views.
And humanistic psychology was emerging too, right? Maslow, Rogers.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Humanistic approaches, emphasizing personal potential, self-actualization, meaning individual responsibility, they were gaining serious traction. So Fromm's focus on personal development, self-awareness, authenticity, the therapeutic relationship, it wasn't just theoretically groundbreaking, it was perfectly in sync with the broader cultural shifts of the era. It felt incredibly fresh and relevant to a generation that was questioning authority and looking for more meaningful ways to understand themselves and the world.
It's amazing how those ideas still echo. Which brings us to today, 2025. How do we see this playing out now? You mentioned mental health platforms earlier, things like BetterHelp, Talkspace.
Yeah, it's a fascinating connection. The explosion of these online mental health platforms is a really interesting modern phenomenon to look at through a Frommian lens.
How so? Because they're obviously not the same as traditional in-person therapy.
Not at all the same, but in many ways, they mirror Fromm's core emphasis on self-knowledge, or at least the beginning of that journey. Think about what they offer. They encourage users, millions of them, to reflect on their emotions, their thoughts, their behaviors.
Through things like guided journaling, mood tracking.
Exactly. Guided journaling prompts, mood logs, cognitive exercises designed to increase self-awareness. This directly echoes Fromm's fundamental belief that self-understanding is the bedrock, the absolute cornerstone for psychological health and well-being. They are making tools for self-reflection accessible on an unprecedented scale.
And accessibility is a huge plus, right? Lowering the barrier to entry.
Huge plus. It gets people thinking about their mental health who might never have walked into a therapist's office. However, and this is a big however.
There's a depth challenge.
There's definitely a depth challenge compared to the kind of in-person reciprocal relationship Fromm described. While these apps can absolutely initiate self-reflection, provide useful tools, and offer support, achieving that profound level of co-learning, that nuanced moment-to-moment shared journey, that's much harder through a screen, or especially through text messages or asynchronous communication.
You lose the immediate feedback, the nonverbal cues.
You lose a lot of the subtle data. A quick check-in, a worksheet, even a video call, while definitely helpful for certain issues or for maintenance, might fall short of facilitating the kind of deep transformative self-discovery that Fromm saw emerging from sustained empathetic human presence. So they're a fantastic starting point, a valuable tool for self-exploration and skill building, maybe great for benign issues.
But maybe not the whole journey for deeper work.
Perhaps not the whole journey, especially if you're aiming for that profound level of self-knowledge Fromm is talking about. That often requires the consistent, attuned presence of another human being over time.
So, thinking about this first chapter, what's the core message for you listening right now? Fromm seems to be saying that therapy, at its best, isn't just about getting rid of symptoms. It's this shared expedition into understanding yourself more deeply.
A journey.
And the real breakthroughs, the real change happen when both people involved, therapist and client, are genuinely learning, genuinely growing together, seeing each other as equals on this path of understanding.
Absolutely. And the question from Fromm implicitly asks you is, why is this self-awareness so crucial? Not just for therapy, but for living a fulfilling life. It's about understanding your own drives, your reactions, your patterns, the conscious and the unconscious ones, so you can start making conscious choices. So you can live more deliberately rather than just being pushed around by forces you don't even recognize.
It gives you agency.
It gives you agency. And what's lovely about this first chapter and audiobook presentation is Fromm's style. It's warm, it's conversational, even though the ideas are deep. It feels less like an academic treatise and more like a personal invitation.
Like he's talking directly to you.
Exactly. An invitation to explore your own mind. It makes it really accessible, whether you're totally new to psychoanalysis or you've been on a personal development path for years. He doesn't just tell you what self-knowledge is. He inspires you to actually start that journey, emphasizing that it's this vital, ongoing process for every single one of us.
Okay, we have definitely just scratched the surface of knowing oneself from amazing work here. If you're finding these insights valuable, if this is sparking something for you, please do take a moment to like this deep dive, subscribe to BookPodCastZone so you don't miss future explorations like this, and maybe share it with someone you know who's curious about understanding themselves better.
Yeah, spread the word.
Okay, now let's move on. Because in the next chapter, Fromm really takes on a giant of psychology, right? Chapter 2. And this is where Fromm makes a really bold move, I think. He directly challenges Sigmund Freud on his view of the child.
Doesn't pull any punches, does he?
Not at all. Freud, as many people know, sometimes characterized children in ways that sound pretty harsh today, like inherently guilty, maybe even like mini-criminals, driven by these primal urges, incestuous feelings, violent impulses, the Oedipus complex, that kind of thing. Fromm takes significant issue with this whole framework.
And it's important to understand why this critique was so significant and why Fromm felt it was necessary. He elaborates that Freud's theories, while absolutely groundbreaking for their time, often had this unintended consequence of, well, implicitly defending traditional parental authority and the societal status quo.
How so? By locating the problem within the child.
Exactly. Freud tended to pathologize many childhood behaviors, seeing them as direct manifestations of inherent, often dark, internal drives. The focus was very much on the child's instincts. Fromm, however, argued really forcefully that this perspective largely overlooked, or at least drastically downplayed, the profound and often damaging impact of the environment, the societal context, the family dynamics, the parents' behavior, and their own unconscious issues. All of that got short shrift in the classical view.
And what's the potential harm in viewing children primarily through that older Freudian lens?
The potential harm is significant. If you see a child's difficult behavior solely as a result of their inherent badness or uncontrollable instincts, it can inadvertently absolve parents and society of their responsibility in shaping that child's development. It puts the burden entirely on the child.
Leads to blaming the victim almost.
It can, yes.
Yeah.
And it risks fostering a punitive or controlling approach to parenting and education, rather than an understanding or empathetic one. If a child is just seen as needing to suppress their bad instincts, you might miss the underlying needs or the environmental stressors causing the behavior. It could inhibit healthy emotional development, stifle natural curiosity, suppress authentic expression, all by labeling normal, albeit sometimes challenging exploratory behavior as inherently flawed or driven by guilt.
So this is a really fundamental shift Fromm is proposing. He's not just tweaking Freud, he's advocating for a completely different perspective, a humanistic one. Seeing children not primarily as these bundles of biological drives or inherent guilt, but as beings profoundly shaped by their environment.
Precisely. Their behaviors, whether we label them good or bad, are often, in Fromm's view, meaningful responses to the world around them. They're communicating something.
And the implications of that shift, they must be massive for how we approach kids, both in therapy and just in everyday parenting.
Oh, absolutely massive. If a child's behavior is primarily a response to their environment, their family system, the emotional climate at home, school pressures, cultural expectations, then understanding and addressing that environment becomes paramount.
So instead of asking what's wrong with this child,
Fromm invites us to ask, what is happening to this child? What is their environment communicating to them? What needs aren't being met? It shifts the focus dramatically. For therapy, this means interventions move beyond just trying to fix the child's internal state. It necessitates looking at the family system, maybe even involving parents or addressing school issues. The context becomes part of the treatment.
and for parenting,
For parenting, it encourages empathy, above all. It encourages seeing a child's actions, even tantrums or defiance, as communication, albeit sometimes clumsy communication of their needs, feelings, or stresses. It guides parents towards creating a nurturing, responsive, understanding environment, rather than solely focusing on discipline and suppressing those undesirable instincts. It puts the onus back on us as adults, as parents, as a society, to create the conditions where children can actually flourish emotionally and psychologically.
that feels so much more empowering, both for the child and the parent, actually. It must have been quite a statement back then, given how dominant Freud's ideas were.
It really was. You have to remember, in the mid-20th century, Freud's theories were practically gospel in many psychoanalytic circles. They exerted this immense influence over how childhood, development, and neurosis were understood. But the intellectual tides were definitely beginning to turn.
Other critics were emerging.
Yes, critics like Fromm, and also other really important figures like Karen Horney, who was actually Fromm's own analyst for a time, and a major influence, they began systematically challenging Freud's intense focus on instinctual drives. They argued that social and cultural factors played a much more significant role in shaping personality and causing psychological distress than Freud had allowed.
So Fromm wasn't entirely alone in this.
Not entirely alone, but he was a very prominent voice. And his work, particularly in the 1960s and 1970s, resonated so deeply because it coincided with these broader social movements happening across the West. Think about the counterculture, the civil rights movement, feminism, all questioning traditional authority structures.
Right. Questioning government, education.
And parental roles, too. The very nature of the family was being re-examined. So Fromm's critique of Freud's child psychology wasn't happening in a vacuum. It became part of this larger cultural conversation, advocating for more democratic, more humane, more understanding relationships between generations, between genders, across society. It made his arguments feel incredibly timely, relevant, and progressive.
And fast forward to 2025, we can see direct echoes of this thinking in modern parenting trends, can't we? You mentioned gentle parenting earlier.
Yes, gentle parenting is such a perfect contemporary example. It feels like a direct descendant of Fromm's humanistic view of the child. You see it everywhere now, especially on social media platforms like TikTok or Instagram.
What are the hallmarks of it?
Well, you see parenting influencers, psychologists, and everyday parents promoting things like empathetic communication, validating a child's feelings, even difficult ones, emotional coaching, helping kids understand and manage their emotions, and setting boundaries with respect, rather than relying on punishment, shaming, or authoritarian control.
So less because I said so, and more explaining the why.
Exactly. It directly aligns with Fromm's core view that children's behaviors stem from their environment, their developmental stage, and their emotional needs, not from some inherent guilt or innate maliciousness. Specific tactics you hear about, like acknowledging the feeling behind the behavior, I see you're really angry right now, before redirecting the action, or using natural and logical consequences instead of arbitrary punishments. These all embody Fromm's philosophy.
It's about understanding the root cause.
Precisely. The fundamental idea is, if a child is acting out, they aren't intentionally being bad. They're communicating something. Maybe an unmet need, maybe they're overwhelmed, maybe they lack a skill, maybe they're responding to stress in their environment. Gentle parenting encourages parents to become like behavioral detectives seeking to understand the why behind the action, rather than just reacting to or punishing the what.
Which hopefully fosters a deeper connection.
That's the goal. Deeper connection, greater emotional intelligence in the child, and hopefully a more harmonious family life built on understanding rather than conflict and control. It really shifts the entire interaction paradigm from control over the child to connection with the child.
So wrapping up this chapter, the core takeaway seems to be from Combs' really insightful challenge to those older, perhaps more pessimistic views of child psychology. He offers this much more compassionate lens.
Hopeful even.
Yeah, hopeful. And it resonates so strongly with today's focus, especially in parenting and education, on nurturing emotional intelligence, empathy, and understanding the whole child, not just their surface behaviors or test scores.
And again, Fromm delivers this critique with such clarity and humanity in the source material in these transcribed talks. Even if you're not steeped in complex psychological theory, his arguments against Freud's view are really accessible and compelling. He doesn't just tear down the old model, he actively builds up this more hopeful, more understanding framework for how we can approach children and their development, emphasizing their inherent potential for goodness and growth when they're given the right conditions, the right environment.
It really is a refreshing perspective on childhood. If you're gaining new insights from this, finding it helpful, please do give this deep dive a like. Subscribe to BookPodCastZone for more explorations like this one, and share it with anyone you think might benefit: parents, educators, anyone interested in child development.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's move on to the next fascinating concept Fromm introduces. All right, chapter 3. Here, Fromm introduces a distinction that feels really crucial, particularly for understanding therapy and what we can realistically expect from it. He talks about classifying neuroses into two broad categories: benign and malignant.
Yes, this is a very important classification in Fromm's therapeutic thinking. It's not just an academic exercise. It has profound practical implications for how therapy is approached, what the goals might be, and even the prognosis.
So let's break that down. What exactly does Fromm mean by benign neuroses?
Okay, so benign neuroses, according to Fromm, are conditions that are generally more responsive to therapy. The person experiencing them usually retains a pretty good degree of ego strength in reality testing.
Meaning they can still function reasonably well, they know what's real?
Generally, yes. They might be struggling significantly, but their core sense of self is largely intact, and they can distinguish between their internal experience and external reality. Think about common struggles like, say, mild to moderate anxiety disorders, maybe social anxiety, generalized anxiety, or situational depression, perhaps related to a loss or a major life change, or certain specific phobias like a fear of flying or public speaking.
Things that cause distress and impairment but don't totally shatter their world.
Exactly. The suffering itself often motivates them strongly to seek help and engage in the therapeutic process. They want to change. For these kinds of benign neuroses, Fromm suggests that common treatment outcomes often involve significant symptom reduction, learning better coping mechanisms, gaining insight into the patterns causing the distress, and achieving a noticeable increase in overall well-being and functioning, often within a, let's say, reasonable time frame, because that core self is still relatively healthy and available to do the work.
Okay, that makes sense. So what about the other side of the coin, malignant neuroses? That sounds much more serious.
It is. Malignant neuroses, in Fromm's framework, are far more severe, deeply entrenched, and fundamentally impact the core personality structure and the person's relationship with reality. These would include conditions like severe, pervasive personality disorders. He particularly mentions severe narcissism or deeply ingrained character disorders, where destructive patterns are egocentric, meaning the person doesn't see them as a problem, or conditions involving psychosis, where there's a significant break from reality.
So we're talking about conditions where the person's whole way of being in the world is distorted.
Yes, fundamentally distorted. There might be severe disturbances in their sense of self, a profound lack of empathy, an inability to form or maintain healthy relationships, chronic emptiness, or significant distortions in thinking and perception. For example, someone with severe narcissistic personality disorder might genuinely lack the capacity for empathy, be highly resistant to acknowledging their own harmful patterns, and see any challenge as a personal attack. They might not experience their condition as problematic. The problem is always externalized. It's always someone else's fault.
That sounds incredibly challenging to treat.
Immensely challenging. The complexity is huge. Progress, if it occurs, is often very slow, incremental, and marked by setbacks. Just establishing and maintaining a therapeutic alliance, that basic working relationship, can be incredibly difficult because the very nature of the pathology often involves mistrust, manipulation, or an inability to connect authentically. These cases typically require much more intensive, specialized, and often longer-term therapeutic approaches. Sometimes the goal isn't even a cure in the traditional sense.
So this classification, benign versus malignant, how does it actually influence the expectations and the strategies used in therapy? It sounds like you'd approach them very differently.
Absolutely fundamentally differently. For benign neuroses, the therapeutic strategy might be more focused, perhaps more directive. It could involve working directly on symptom relief, developing specific coping skills, like relaxation techniques for anxiety, exploring conscious and preconscious conflicts or patterns that contribute to the distress, maybe using cognitive restructuring. The expectation, reasonably, is often a return to a previous level of functioning, or even achieving a higher level of well-being and life satisfaction, perhaps within a matter of months or a couple of years. Therapy might involve providing practical tools and insights the patient can readily understand and apply.
More solution-focused, in a way.
It can be, yes, or insight-oriented, but with a clearer path towards resolution. Now, for malignant neuroses, the entire strategy shifts. It becomes much more foundational, much more about building basic capacities that might be missing or severely damaged.
Like building blocks.
Exactly. It's often less about immediate symptom eradication, though symptom management is important, and more about developing basic ego functions, improving impulse control, building a more coherent and stable sense of self, enhancing reality testing, developing a capacity for emotional regulation, or even fostering a minimal ability to trust or form attachments.
So the goals are different.
The goals and expectations are vastly different. You shift from expecting a rapid cure to focusing on managing symptoms to prevent harm, improving baseline functioning perhaps only slightly, building foundational relational skills, and often providing long-term consistent support and containment. Therapy might focus primarily on creating a secure, predictable, non-judgmental environment where the patient can feel safe. It involves patiently working through deeply ingrained, often pre-verbal relational patterns and defenses, managing potential crises, and recognizing that profound characterological change, if possible at all, is a monumental undertaking that could span years, even decades. Or the goal might be more compensatory, helping the person function better despite the underlying pathology.
But Fromm still held out hope, didn't he? Even in these really difficult cases.
Yes, and this is crucial to his humanism. He strongly believed that even within the most challenging, seemingly intractable malignant cases, transformative moments, perhaps small, perhaps fleeting, could still emerge. And the key, deeply empathetic listening.
Not giving up on connection.
Never giving up on the attempt to connect and understand. This doesn't mean magically curing a severe personality disorder with empathy. It means recognizing that the nuanced role of empathy in these incredibly difficult therapeutic relationships is paramount. It's not about pity, it's not about condoning harmful behavior. It's about genuinely, persistently attempting to understand the patient's subjective reality, their inner world, no matter how distorted or painful or alien it might appear from the outside.
Trying to see the world through their eyes.
Exactly. Holding space for their profound pain, their rage, their confusion, their unique and often terrifying way of experiencing existence without judgment. This deep, unwavering, empathetic connection from believed can in itself be profoundly healing and validating, even if it doesn't lead to a complete remission of all symptoms. It affirms the patient's core humanity, especially when they might feel utterly isolated, fragmented, and unseen by the world. It's a lifeline.
This distinction must have been incredibly valuable back in the 1970s. The field was still trying to figure out how to help people with these more severe conditions, right?
It was incredibly valuable. In the 70s, psychoanalysis and psychiatry were definitely grappling with how to effectively treat a much broader spectrum of mental health conditions than just the worried well. There was a growing recognition that the classical Freudian approach, often involving long-term analysis focused on uncovering unconscious conflict, wasn't always sufficient or even appropriate for patients with more severe pathologies, like borderline conditions or psychosis.
They needed different tools.
They needed different tools, different frameworks, different expectations. Fromm's classification wasn't created in a vacuum. It built upon the work of other important contemporaries, like Harry Stack Sullivan, who founded interpersonal psychoanalysis, and also emphasized how individual pathology manifests and is shaped within relationships. Sullivan looked closely at conditions like schizophrenia from an interpersonal perspective. So Fromm's chapter reflects this broader movement in the field during that era, a shift towards more individualized treatment plans. It was about moving away from rigid, one-size-fits-all diagnostic categories and towards a more nuanced understanding of the unique needs, the therapeutic possibilities, and the prognostic outlook for each patient based on the nature and severity of their neurosis. Tailoring the approach to the person, not forcing the person into a pre-existing theoretical box.
And we absolutely see this individualized approach in practice today, in 2025. Therapists might not use Fromm's exact terms, benign and malignant, but the principle is alive and well.
Oh, absolutely. The principle of tailoring treatment to the severity and nature of the condition is fundamental to modern psychotherapy. For instance, think about cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT.
Right, that's very common now.
Very common and widely recognized as highly effective for many conditions that Fromm would likely classify as benign neuroses, things like panic disorder, social anxiety, specific phobias, mild to moderate depression. Why does CBT align well here? Because it focuses on identifying and changing specific, maladaptive thought patterns and behaviors that are often more accessible and amenable to direct intervention in these less severe conditions.
It's practical, structured.
Very practical, often structured, and goal-oriented. It can provide relatively rapid relief for individuals struggling with these specific issues by helping them develop concrete coping strategies, challenge irrational thoughts, and change problematic behaviors. It's a very effective here-and-now approach for identifiable problems where the underlying personality structure is largely intact.
Okay, so that's the benign side. What about treatments for the more malignant conditions Fromm described?
Well, for the more complex, severe conditions, things like borderline personality disorder, complex trauma, perhaps some forms of severe narcissistic pathology therapies like dialectical behavior therapy or DBT, are often considered the gold standard, or at least a highly effective approach.
DBT developed by Marshall Linehan, right?
That's right. And DBT is specifically designed for individuals struggling with severe emotional dysregulation, impulsivity, unstable relationships, and often self-harming behaviors, hallmarks of what Fromm might call a more malignant presentation. DBT integrates core components of CBT with mindfulness practices, and crucially, it focuses on teaching skills in 4 key areas: mindfulness, distress tolerance, emotion regulation, and interpersonal effectiveness.
So it's much more comprehensive.
Much more comprehensive, multifaceted, intensive, and typically requires a longer-term commitment, often involving both individual therapy and group skills training. This directly aligns with Fromm's call for tailored approaches. DBT acknowledges that these deeper-seated, more fundamental difficulties in self-structure, emotional processing, and relating to others necessitate a different, more robust and supportive therapeutic journey than what might suffice for a more circumscribed, benign neurosis. It's not just about changing a thought. It's about building a whole new framework for experiencing emotions and relating to the world.
So reflecting on this chapter, the core message seems to be Fromm's incredibly insightful analysis of how different kinds of mental health challenges really do require unique therapeutic strategies and expectations. It helps us understand why some therapies work well for certain issues and why patience, persistence, and a different kind of therapeutic relationship are so vital for others.
Exactly. And Fromm makes this very clear through his practical examples in the seminar transcripts. He discusses, for instance, a specific case study involving a benign neurosis from his own practice, which really brings the concepts to life. It makes this chapter incredibly engaging for listeners who are genuinely interested in the nuances of mental health, the realities of therapy, and the practical application of psychological theory. He moves beyond simple definitions to show the real-world impact of this distinction, helping us differentiate between different types or depths of psychological suffering and what might be needed to alleviate them.
Fromm's distinctions on neuroses really do offer a clearer, more nuanced map for navigating the complex landscape of mental health. If this deep dive is helping you understand these important nuances, please show your support by liking it, subscribing to BookPodCastZone so you stay updated, and sharing it with your friends, family, or anyone who might find it valuable.
Please do.
Okay, onwards to the next chapter. All right, let's move on to chapter 4. Here, Frommer really digs into the question of what actually makes therapy work, what leads to real, lasting change. And interestingly, he starts by taking issue with another famous Freudian concept, analysis, terminable and interminable.
Yes, he uses Freud's own reflections as a jumping-off point to discuss what he sees as the more crucial factors.
So first, maybe unpack that Freudian idea a bit. Analysis, terminal and interminable. What was Freud getting at there?
Well, that was the title of a late paper by Freud, written in 1937. In it, he was grappling with the question of the length of psychoanalysis and whether it could ever truly be considered finished or terminated. He pondered if there were limits to its effectiveness, if some resistances or instinctual demands might be fundamentally intractable.
So he was kind of pessimistic about reaching a definitive end.
He expressed significant reservations, yeah. He suggested that perhaps the goal wasn't always a complete cure, but maybe strengthening the ego to manage conflicts better, and he acknowledged that some analyses might, for various reasons, become effectively interminable and ongoing, potentially lifelong process. It reflected a certain degree of clinical realism, perhaps, but also a potential pessimism about the depth of change possible for some people.
Okay. And Fromm felt this concept was insufficient or problematic.
Fromm found it insufficient and perhaps even a bit problematic because he felt it could potentially lead to an overly prolonged, somewhat passive, or even fatalistic view of therapy. Focusing too much on whether analysis ends can distract from the more important question, what actually causes change while it's happening?
Right. Shifting the focus from duration to dynamics.
Exactly. Fromm's critique wasn't just a theoretical quibble, it was deeply practical. He wanted to shift the focus away from the length or endpoint of analysis and squarely onto the active ingredients, the dynamic, living elements within the therapeutic process itself that genuinely foster transformation. He believed that simply uncovering unconscious material, as Freud emphasized, wasn't enough on its own. What truly mattered for Fromm was the living interaction, the quality of the relationship, and the actual internal shifts, emotional, cognitive, relational, that occurred because of that interaction.
So if it's not just about endless analysis or simply uncovering the past, then what is the key for Fromm? What does he point to as the real driver of change?
He points directly and powerfully to the therapeutic relationship itself. He positions the quality of the connection, the interaction between the analyst and the patient, as the primary catalyst, the crucible for change.
Okay, but how does that relationship actually work to create change? What specific qualities make it transformative?
This is where Fromm gets really specific and practical. He argues that two qualities in the analyst are absolutely paramount: deep, genuine empathy and unwavering honesty.
Empathy and honesty. Why those two?
Because these qualities, when genuinely embodied by the analyst, actively foster a unique kind of environment, a safe space, a space where the patient feels truly seen, truly heard, truly understood, without judgment. And it's only within that safety that they can find the courage to confront difficult, painful truths about themselves, their past, their patterns, their relationships.
So empathy creates the safety.
Empathy creates the safety and the feeling of being deeply understood. Fromm's idea of empathy here isn't just intellectual understanding or sympathy, feeling for someone. It's that ability to genuinely feel with the patient, to resonate with their emotional experience, to understand their pain, confusion, anger, or joy from within their frame of reference. It's an active emotional tuning in.
And honesty, where does that fit in? It sounds potentially harsh.
It could be harsh if not paired with empathy and respect. But Fromm's concept of honesty here is about authenticity and providing genuine, respectful feedback, even when it's challenging. It's about the analyst not hiding behind a professional facade, not offering platitudes or false reassurance, but being real within the bounds of the therapeutic role. It means reflecting back what they see, gently challenging defenses or inconsistencies, offering interpretations grounded in what's happening in the room, all in the service of the patient's growth. It's this combination of deep, empathetic holding and authentic, honest engagement that Fromm believes creates the conditions for real change.
And this ties back to the idea of the analyst as a co-participant, not just a detached observer.
Absolutely. This is a crucial thread running through Fromm's work. His view of the analyst as a co-participant, actively engaged in the shared exploration, is fundamental here. It's a radical departure from those earlier psychoanalytic models where the analyst aimed for neutrality and distance.
So the therapist isn't just doing therapy to the patient.
No, they are engaged with the patient in this mutual journey. Fromm emphasizes mutual growth, the idea that the therapist is also potentially changed and learns through the encounter. The active engaged role he envisions means the therapist is present, authentic, vulnerable in an appropriate boundaried way, and willing to be affected by the patient's experience. This reciprocal engagement, this genuine meeting of two human beings, is what builds profound trust and allows insights to emerge dynamically from the interaction itself. Rather than being solely transmitted intellectually from analyst to analyst, and it becomes a true collaboration.
That's such a powerful and I imagine more hopeful vision of how therapy can work. And Fromm's own background and influences played a big role here too, right?
They certainly did. His thinking was profoundly shaped by his experiences and his intellectual lineage. As we mentioned, his mentor Karen Horney was crucial. She also broke away from Freud's more rigid biological determinism to emphasize social and cultural factors and the importance of the real self.
Right.
Fromm was also a key figure in the interpersonal psychoanalysis movement, pioneered by people like Harry Stack Sullivan, which, as the name suggests, placed relational dynamics absolutely central to understanding both psychological health and pathology. And again, the timing of his 1974 seminar, where much of the art of listening originates, is key. Humanistic psychology Rogers, Maslow, was really hitting its stride, actively challenging the detached, clinical, sometimes pathologizing approaches of earlier psychoanalysis.
So Fromm was riding that wave or maybe helping create it?
Both, I think.
Yeah.
His focus on empathy, authenticity, the healing power of the relationship, self-actualization, it wasn't just innovative within psychoanalysis, it was deeply resonant with the burgeoning humanistic movement. It was a powerful call to rehumanize therapy, shifting it from a purely medical or technical model towards one fundamentally rooted in authentic human connection and mutual respect.
And thinking about 2025 again, how does this emphasis on the relationship, on authenticity show up today? You mentioned therapy podcasts earlier, like the Happiness Lab or others where hosts share personal stories.
Yeah, that's such an interesting modern parallel. The immense popularity of therapy-adjacent podcasts, where hosts often blend scientific findings with personal anecdotes and vulnerability, really reflects Fromm's emphasis on the importance of relational healing and authenticity, even in these non-traditional formats.
How so? Because it's not actual therapy.
It's not therapy, no. But think about why they resonate. Hosts like Dr. Laurie Santos on the Happiness Lab, or Esther Perel in her Where Should We Begin podcast, where you hear real couple sessions, or even Brené Brown talking about vulnerability. They often share personal stories, their own struggles, moments of insight, their own learning journey. They don't just present themselves as experts lecturing from on high.
They make themselves relatable, human.
Exactly. They create a sense of shared human experience. This directly mirrors Fromm's belief that therapists or anyone in a guiding, helping role must be authentic and genuinely engaged with those they are trying to reach. That authenticity is a powerful catalyst for trust. It makes the insights they share feel more relatable, less prescriptive, more trustworthy.
It builds a connection, even through headphones.
It builds a bridge. When a host or a therapist shares appropriately from their own experience, it creates a sense of safety, permission, and shared humanity that facilitates connection, even just through audio. Listeners often feel they are part of a conversation, part of a shared exploration, not just being passively talked at. And that feeling is very much in line with Fromm's vision of the therapist as a co-participant.
Are there downsides to that, though, in the podcast context?
Oh, sure. The obvious downside is the lack of personalization. It's a one-to-many format, not tailored to your specific situation. There's also the risk of parasocial relationships, where the listener feels a strong connection, but it's entirely one-sided. And it certainly can't replace the depth, nuance, and interactive feedback loop of actual therapy. But as a way of modeling authenticity and relational connection and making psychological ideas feel more human and accessible, it's a powerful reflection of Fromm's principles playing out in the modern media landscape.
So wrapping up Chapter 4, the core takeaway feels like Fromm is offering a kind of masterclass in empathy and connection as the engines of change. It's not just about clever techniques or endlessly analyzing the past.
No, it's about the profound power of the human-to-human connection, the therapeutic relationship itself, when it's characterized by empathy and honesty. That's where the real transformation becomes possible.
It really demystifies the process.
It does. And his conversational tone in the original seminars, combined with the vivid, real-world case discussions he includes, makes this chapter an absolute must-listen or must-read for anyone curious about how therapy truly works. It peels back the layers beyond those superficial perceptions of just talking about your problems and reveals the deeper relational dynamics that are actually at play in fostering growth and healing.
Understanding what truly drives change in therapy, as Fromm explains it, feels incredibly valuable, whether you're in therapy, considering it, or just want to understand human connection better. If you're finding this exploration meaningful, if it's resonating, please do like this deep dive, subscribe to Book Podcast Zone for more insights like these, and share it with others who you think seek this kind of understanding.
Yeah, definitely share the insights.
All right, let's move into what is arguably the core theme of the entire work. Okay, chapter 5. And this feels like the absolute heart of the book, doesn't it? I mean, the title is The Art of Listening. Here, Fromm defines listening not just as a passive skill, but as the very essence, the core of therapy.
It really is the centerpiece. Everything else we've discussed, self-knowledge, the relationship, empathy, it all converges here in the act of listening.
And he uses this incredibly beautiful, profound comparison to illustrate what he means. He says listening, really listening in therapy, is like understanding poetry. That analogy just stopped me in my tracks. It suggests something so much deeper than just hearing words.
It's a truly powerful analogy, isn't it? Because when Fromm compares deep listening to information, what does understanding poetry require?
You have to listen for rhythm, for imagery, for subtext, for feeling.
Exactly. It means listening deeply for the unspoken meanings, the subtle rhythms of emotion in the speaker's voice, the hidden metaphors they use consciously or unconsciously to describe their experience. It's about sensing the emotional resonance that lies beneath the surface narrative. Just like a good poem communicates through implication, through symbolism, through cadence and feeling as much as, or even more than, direct statement, Fromm is saying a person conveys their deepest self in the same way.
So it's about grasping the whole human experience being conveyed.
The full human experience. The pauses, the hesitations, the tone of voice, the contradictions, the things not said, the body language, if you're in person. It's about grasping the entire communication, not just the literal words. It requires this profound attunement to the speaker's inner world, moving beyond the literal content to perceive the underlying symbolic and emotional landscape. It's an active, interpretive, deeply engaged act, not passive reception.
Wow. Okay, so how do we do that? Thankfully, Fromm doesn't just leave it at the poetic analogy. He outlines 6 practical yet incredibly profound rules for effective listening. And these feel like they apply far beyond just the therapy room.
Oh, absolutely. These are principles for deep human connection in any context. They're truly transformative if you practice them. Should we walk through them?
Yes, let's definitely unpack each one.
Okay, rule number 1, complete concentration.
Sounds simple, but probably isn't.
Deceptively simple. This means being fully present and attentive. It's not just about putting down your phone or making eye contact. It's about achieving internal stillness. Emptying your mind of your own distracting thoughts, your judgments, your worries, your plans for what you're going to say next. It requires actively suspending your inner monologue and dedicating your entire mental and emotional space to the speaker right here, right now.
That's incredibly hard in our hyper-distracted world.
It's incredibly hard. Our minds are constantly jumping ahead, evaluating, planning. Complete concentration is a discipline, a practice of bringing your full attention back again and again to the other person.
Okay, rule 2.
Rule 2, freedom from anxiety or greed.
Anxiety or greed? Greed seems like an odd word here.
It does, but it's very insightful. Freedom from anxiety means approaching the conversation without being preoccupied by your own fears. Fear of saying the wrong thing, fear of being judged, fear of what you might hear. But freedom from greed is about approaching the conversation without any personal agendas, without a greed or desire for a specific outcome from the interaction.
Like wanting them to agree with you or needing to win the argument or even just wanting them to like you.
Precisely. If you're anxious about how you're coming across, or if you're secretly trying to manipulate the conversation towards your own desired conclusion, or if you're greedy for their approval or for them to change in a way you want, then you are not truly listening to their reality. Your own self-interest, your own needs and fears are distorting your perception of what they're actually saying and experiencing. This rule demands a kind of radical selflessness in the moment of listening, putting the other person's experience absolutely first.
That freedom from greed one, wow. That really makes you stop and think about how often we enter conversations with our own hidden agenda, doesn't it? Even if it's just wanting to feel helpful or smart. How can we realistically practice that in everyday life, in our relationships?
It's a profound challenge, but it's possible. It starts with conscious intention. Before or during a conversation, especially a difficult one, you can consciously set the intention to only listen, to only understand. Imagine you're like an anthropologist trying to understand a completely different culture, or like you're collecting information purely for their benefit, not yours.
Suspend the urge to fix or advise.
Exactly. Actively suspend your desire to jump in with advice, to fix their problem, to judge their choices, to share your own related story immediately, or to steer the conversation in a direction you find more comfortable or interesting. It requires constant vigilance against your own ego's intrusions. It is incredibly difficult, especially when you care about the person or the topic. But when you manage even moments of it, the other person feels it. They feel truly heard, perhaps for the first time. And the entire dynamic of the conversation can shift from a potential debate or parallel monologues into a genuine collaborative exploration. It's a radical act of humility and respect.
Okay. Powerful stuff. What's rule number 3?
Rule 3. A vivid imagination.
Imagination. How does that fit with listening?
This isn't about making things up or fantasizing. It's about using your capacity for imagination to mentally enter the speaker's world. It's the ability to visualize what they are describing, to try and feel what they might be feeling based on their words and tone, to understand their perspective from the inside out. It goes beyond just grasping the facts. It's about using your inner world to create a resonant understanding of their lived experience. It allows you to form a more comprehensive, more multisensory mental picture of their situation as they perceive it. It makes their experience more real to you.
Got it. Rule 4?
Rule 4. Empathy. We touched on this earlier, but here Fromm really centers it. And again, he emphasizes it's about feeling with the other person, not just for them.
The difference between empathy and sympathy.
Precisely. Sympathy might be feeling pity or sorrow for someone's misfortune, often from a slight distance. Empathy, in Fromm's sense, is a much deeper emotional resonance. It's the capacity to access a similar feeling within yourself, perhaps from your own past experiences, perhaps just through human connection, as a way to genuinely understand what they're going through emotionally. It's a profound connection where you allow yourself to be touched, to be affected by their emotions, creating a kind of shared emotional space. It's about truly understanding the emotional music behind their words, sometimes even recognizing feelings they haven't fully articulated themselves yet.
Okay. Rule 5.
Rule 5. Patience.
Another tough one in our instant gratification culture.
Isn't it just? Patience in listening means allowing the other person's narrative, their thoughts, their feelings, to unfold naturally at their own pace. It means actively resisting the urge to interrupt, to finish their sentences, to rush them along, to offer premature advice, or to jump to conclusions and judgments. It means being comfortable with silences, allowing the speaker space to gather their thoughts, to go deeper, maybe to backtrack or circle around an idea. Patience trusts that the full story, the important insights, the real meaning, will emerge if you simply provide the space, the time, and the unwavering attention. Don't push the river, let it flow.
That requires a lot of trust in the process and in the other person.
It does. Trust and restraint.
And finally, Rule 6.
Rule 6, the inseparability of understanding and love.
Love. Now, that really sounds unusual in the context of listening techniques.
It sounds unusual, but it's central to Fromm's humanistic philosophy. This is a kind of capstone principle. Fromm suggests that true, deep intellectual understanding, that insightful grasp of another person in their fullness, is fundamentally, inextricably intertwined with genuine human connection, with care, with respect, with what he broadly terms love.
Not romantic love, obvious.
No, definitely not romantic love. He means love in the broader humanistic agape sense, a benevolent concern for the other's well-being, growth, and unfolding, a fundamental respect for their inherent worth as a human being. Fromm argues that you cannot truly, profoundly understand someone if you approach them with cold detachment, or worse, with indifference or contempt. True understanding requires approaching them from a place of genuine care, openness, and affirmation. It's about seeing the person behind the words, the struggles, the defenses, and connecting with our core humanity. For Fromm, the act of deep listening is an act of love.
Wow. Those 6 rules. They're simple to list, but living them out feels like a life's work.
It really does. And thinking about the context again, these talks were mostly from 1974. Fromm was masterfully synthesizing decades of psychoanalytic thought, existentialist philosophy. You can hear echoes of thinkers like Martin Buber in that last rule. Buber's ideas about the I-thou relationship versus the I-it.
Where you treat the other as a full person, not an object.
Exactly. A genuine encounter, a real dialogue. And remember, the 1970s also saw this burgeoning cultural interest in mindfulness, presence, self-awareness, often influenced by Eastern philosophies making their way west. Fromm's rules, especially concentration and patience, remarkably anticipate and align with these burgeoning mindfulness movements. He was articulating, from a Western psychological perspective, the timeless importance of being fully present, attentive, and compassionate in human interactions. There really are timeless principles for connection, making them just as relevant, maybe even more relevant, in our often distracted world today than they were then. He was definitely ahead of his time in pinpointing how critical presence is for deep connection.
And we can definitely see attempts to cultivate that presence in modern mindfulness practices today, can't we? It makes Fromm's rules feel less abstract, more achievable with practice.
You're absolutely right. Think about the explosion of guided meditation apps, Headspace, Calm, Insight Timer, scores of others. What are they fundamentally teaching? They're training your attention. They echo Fromm's call for complete concentrated listening first, perhaps, listening to your own breath, your own body, your own thoughts without judgment, which then builds the capacity to listen to others with that same focused, non-reactive presence. They train the mind to be fully present and less caught up in internal distraction.
Building the listening muscle.
Exactly. And similarly, look at therapeutic approaches like mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, MBCT, or acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT. Therapists trained in these modalities explicitly utilize very similar principles to stay fully present with their clients. They practice observing their own internal reactions, thoughts, feelings, judgments, without getting swept away by them, which allows them to remain truly attuned and responsive to the client's moment-to-moment experience. This absolutely validates Fromm's approach. It shows that the principles he laid out decades ago are now recognized as foundational to many effective contemporary therapeutic practices. They provide concrete methods for cultivating the inner state required for deep listening, deliberately training your attention and empathetic capacity.
So, wrapping up this incredibly rich chapter, the core takeaway is really Fromm's elevation of listening to a transformative art form. It's not just about technique, it's a way of being with another person that can foster profound understanding and connection.
It's a path to intimacy, really.
And it feels like a gift he's offering, a way to change how we connect, not just in formal therapy, but in every single interaction we have. It offers a clear pathway to potentially deeper, more meaningful relationships across the board.
And those 6 rules, they aren't just abstract ideals. They feel practical, yet deeply profound. The warmth and humanity that come through in the audiobook's narration, capturing from Fromm's original seminar style, truly bring this chapter to life. It offers you, the listener, tangible tools, or at least aspirations, to improve not just therapeutic interactions, if that's relevant for you, but literally every conversation, every relationship in your life. It really elevates listening from something passive we just assume we do into an active, compassionate, deeply engaged art form.
Fromm's art of listening, it really does feel like a kind of superpower we can all cultivate. If you're finding value in these profound insights, if this is sparking ideas for you, please like this deep dive, subscribe to BookPodCastZone for more wisdom like this, and share it widely with anyone who might appreciate learning the art of truly listening.
Yeah, help us spread these important ideas.
Okay, we're nearing the end, but there are still some crucial psychoanalytic concepts Fromm wants to re-examine. Let's move to Chapter 6. Okay, we're now diving into Chapter 6. And here, Fromm tackles some really core, almost foundational concepts in traditional psychoanalysis, specifically dreams, resistance, and transference. But crucially, he doesn't just regurgitate the classic definitions. He brilliantly re-examines them through his unique humanistic and relational lens.
Yes, this is where you really see him engaging directly with Freudian concepts, but giving them his own distinct spin, filtering them through his humanistic values. It's not a rejection, necessarily, but a significant reinterpretation.
So let's take them one by one. First up, dreams. How does Fromm's view differ from, say, the classic Freudian take?
Well, Freud famously called dreams the royal road to the unconscious, and his interpretation often heavily emphasized uncovering repressed wishes, particularly sexual or aggressive desires, often disguised by complex symbolism, the whole manifest versus latent content idea. Fromm certainly agrees that dreams are a vital window into the unconscious. However, he views them more broadly, perhaps more optimistically. He sees them as richly symbolic expressions of our entire psyche, including our hopes, our fears, our creativity, our struggles with existential issues, our attempts to solve problems.
So not just repressed desires.
Not just repressed desires, though those might be part of it. He sees dreams as meaningful messages, a kind of internal communication from the deeper self, designed to help us integrate different aspects of our experience, process emotions, or even point towards potential growth. For Fromm, a dream might be your psyche wrestling with a major life decision, or processing a conflict you're avoiding in waking life, or even offering up a creative solution or a new perspective. He encourages interpreting dreams not just to excavate hidden complexes, but primarily to foster profound self-understanding, self-acceptance, and personal integration. It's about listening respectfully to the deep wisdom of your own psyche as it speaks in its own unique symbolic language.
That feels much more expansive.
Yeah.
Okay, next concept. Resistance. How does Fromm reframe this? Freud often saw resistance as the patient actively opposing the therapeutic process, right? Like fighting against uncovering painful truths.
Yes, Freud often viewed resistance as an unconscious defense mechanism, certainly, but sometimes with a connotation of the patient being difficult or uncooperative, actively working against the analyst's efforts to bring material into consciousness. Fromm takes a significantly different, more compassionate stance. He understands resistance primarily as a patient's natural, often necessary defense mechanism. It's a protective barrier that shields them from overwhelming anxiety, unbearable pain, or a perceived threat to their sense of self.
So it's not defiance, it's self-protection.
Primarily self-protection. For example, if a patient consistently changes the subject when a difficult topic arises, or forgets appointments, or intellectualizes instead of feeling emotions, Fromm wouldn't immediately label that as defiance or a lack of motivation. He'd see it as a sign that the patient feels threatened, that their defenses are kicking in to protect something vulnerable. He might think about it in terms of Wilhelm Reich's concept of character armor, those habitual, often unconscious defensive patterns individuals develop over time to protect themselves emotionally.
And how does that shift in perspective change the therapist's approach?
It changes it dramatically. Instead of seeing resistance as an obstacle to be overcome or battered down, the therapist, guided by Fromm's view, approaches it with curiosity and respect. The question becomes not, how can I break through this resistance? But what is this resistance protecting? What fear or pain is underneath it? Why is this protection needed right now? It invites empathy and collaboration rather than confrontation. The therapist works with the resistance, seeking to understand its function and help the patient feel safe enough that the defense might eventually be relaxed voluntarily, rather than trying to forcibly dismantle it, which often just makes the patient feel attacked and entrenches the defense further.
That makes so much sense. Okay, the third big one, transference. Freud's idea was mainly about the patient projecting past relationship feelings onto the analyst, right?
Yes. Freud's core concept of transference centered on the patient unconsciously redirecting feelings, desires, and expectations from significant past relationships, especially with parents, onto the analyst. The analyst becomes a stand-in figure, and the patient reenacts old patterns. This is still a cornerstone of psychoanalytic thinking.
But Fromm expands on it.
He expands on it significantly by emphasizing its mutuality. While Freud focused primarily on the patient's projections onto the ideally neutral analyst, Freud highlights that the therapeutic relationship is fundamentally a two-way street. He sees transference-countertransference as a dynamic field where both the analyst and the patient are inevitably affecting and reacting to each other based on their own histories and unconscious patterns.
So the analyst's reactions, countertransference, are just as important.
Absolutely. Fromm moves beyond seeing countertransference merely as interference to be managed. He sees the entire interaction, the patient's projections, the analyst's reactions, the way they navigate conflicts or connections together in the here and now as a rich source of information and learning for both individuals. The therapeutic relationship itself becomes a kind of living laboratory for understanding relational dynamics.
So it emphasizes mutual growth again.
Exactly. It underscores that mutual growth aspect. The interaction reveals patterns relevant to both people. It allows both analyst and patient to gain insight into how past patterns are playing out in the present moment, right there in the room, and crucially, it provides an opportunity to potentially experience and forge new, healthier ways of relating. It's a reciprocal dance, a shared exploration where both partners are potentially learning and evolving.
Wow. Reframing those three core concepts, dreams, resistance, transference, with that humanistic relational emphasis, it must fundamentally alter the whole feel and dynamic of therapy, doesn't it?
It absolutely transforms it. By approaching dreams with open curiosity, rather than a rigid interpretive codebook, the therapist empowers the patient to co-create meaning, honoring their unique subjective experience and giving them agency in understanding their own inner world. It becomes a collaboration.
Right.
With resistance, approaching it with curiosity and respect, instead of frustration or confrontation, fosters an environment of psychological safety. It creates a space where defenses, which are there for a reason, can be gently explored and understood rather than feeling attacked. This allows them to potentially soften naturally when they're no longer needed, rather than being rigidly reinforced.
And with transference,
And by viewing transference-countertransference as a mutual dynamic field, the therapy becomes less about the analyst objectively interpreting the patient, and more about both individuals learning from the complex, real-time interplay of their pasts and presents. It fosters genuine mutual growth and discovery. This whole shift fundamentally alters the dynamic away from that traditional hierarchical expert-patient model towards a much more collaborative, authentic human-to-human encounter. It cultivates trust, safety, and a sense of shared exploration, which Fromm consistently argues are the absolute essentials for profound healing and true self-realization. The therapy becomes a living, breathing, evolving relationship, not just a series of disconnected interpretations.
Looking back historically, how novel was this reframing in the 70s? Were others thinking along similar lines?
Fromm's ideas definitely built on foundations laid by others. His views on dreams expanded Freud's work, certainly. His insights into resistance clearly echo some of Wilhelm Reich's earlier, quite radical work on character armor and the body's defenses. And the focus on the relationship resonates with the interpersonal school. However, Fromm's specific synthesis, consistently applying this humanistic, mutual existential lens to all these core concepts, was quite distinct and novel, especially within mainstream psychoanalytic circles in the 1970s.
So he was pushing the boundaries.
He really was. At a time when many psychoanalytic traditions still heavily emphasize the analyst's neutrality, objectivity, and interpretive authority, from Fromm's unwavering insistence on mutual learning, the analyst's active human participation, and the centrality of empathy directly challenged that prevailing hierarchical dynamic. His approach helped pave the way for the more explicitly relational psychoanalytic theories and other collaborative, client-centered therapies that really gained prominence in the decades that followed. He laid important groundwork.
And connecting this to 2025, how might we see these reframed concepts playing out in our modern world, maybe even influenced by technology and social media?
It's fascinating to consider. Take dreams, for example. You mentioned the popularity of dream journals or discussions on social media, Instagram, Reddit forums, specialized apps. People are sharing their dreams, asking for interpretations, discussing symbolism. This reflects Fromm's view of dreams as meaningful communications, worth exploring for self-understanding. It's a kind of collective, democratized engagement with the symbolic language of the psyche, happening outside the therapist's office. People are trying to decipher their inner world and find shared meaning, much as Fromm's encouraged, making personal exploration more visible and accessible.
A sort of public dream work.
In a way, yes, though obviously lacking the context and depth of therapeutic work. Now, think about resistance and transference in the context of online interactions or even therapy apps. Resistance might manifest differently, maybe ghosting a therapist on an app or consistently engaging only superficially via text. Understanding this not as mere non-compliance, but as a defense mechanism becomes crucial for therapists working in these modalities.
And transference online.
Transference absolutely happens online, perhaps even more intensely or distortedly, sometimes due to the lack of full context. People project all sorts of things on online figures, therapists they only know through a screen, or even onto anonymous commenters. Therapists using telehealth have to be acutely aware of how the digital medium might shape transference and countertransference dynamics. For instance, the perceived distance might make it easier for some patients to project idealized or highly critical feelings onto the therapist. Understanding these dynamics through Fromm's mutual lens, how both parties are co-creating this online relational field, remains incredibly relevant.
It adds another layer of complexity.
It definitely does. And you also see therapists using transference concepts quite explicitly in common practice today, for instance, in couples counseling. A therapist might help a couple see how they're replaying dynamics from their families of origin with each other. Maybe one partner's reaction to criticism triggers the other's childhood feelings of inadequacy. Helping them recognize these projections as projections, understanding the historical roots in a safe space, aligns perfectly with Fromm's insights about how these past dynamics play out and how awareness can lead to healthier interactions. The principles endure even as the context evolves.
So wrapping up Chapter 6, Fromm's insightful analysis really makes these potentially intimidating psychoanalytic concepts feel much more accessible and, well, human. The case examples he uses in the seminars, which come through in the book, make them incredibly engaging for listeners.
Absolutely. He brings these abstract ideas down to earth, showing how they manifest in real people's lives and in the therapy room. And his warm, reflective, humanistic style throughout this chapter really invites listeners to view therapy not as some rigid, overly clinical or mysterious medical process, but as this deeply human, collaborative journey of discovery. It emphasizes the active, dynamic, relational element in understanding the deepest parts of ourselves and how we connect with others.
It really is amazing how Fromm reframes these foundational psychoanalytic ideas, making them feel so relevant and usable. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the art of listening, finding it insightful, please do like this video, subscribe to Book Podcast Zone for more discussions like this, and definitely share it with anyone you think might benefit from these perspectives.
Please do.
Okay, we have one more powerful chapter to explore, and it feels like a culmination of everything Fromm has been building towards. And now we arrive at the final chapter, chapter 7. And for me, this chapter brings everything Fromm has been discussing together with incredible coherence and power. He introduces this truly crucial emphasis. The idea that analysts, therapists, cannot be infallible experts standing apart from the human condition. They are fundamentally human beings themselves, who must engage in their own ongoing self-analysis.
Yes, this is such a vital culmination of his humanistic vision. It underscores the entire philosophy we've been tracing.
So let's dig into that. Why is this self-analysis not just a good idea, but absolutely critical for a therapist to be effective, according to Fromm?
Fromm argues forcefully that therapists must continuously confront their own stuff, their own fears, their biases, their prejudices, their unresolved conflicts, their emotional blind spots. Why? Because if they don't, these unexamined parts of themselves will inevitably interfere with their ability to truly listen and be present with their patients. He powerfully reinforces this with that memorable phrase you mentioned earlier: the analyst is their own next patient.
Meaning the work never ends for the therapist either.
Precisely. It implies that the therapist cannot genuinely, effectively, or ethically guide someone else through the complexities of their internal landscape if they haven't thoroughly and continuously explored their own. The ethical implications are huge. An unanalyzed or insufficiently self-aware therapist risks unconsciously projecting their own issues onto the patient.
How might that look in practice?
Well, they might misinterpret the client's material through the filter of their own unexamined experiences. They might react defensively to certain topics the client brings up because it touches their own wounds. They might unconsciously perpetuate unhealthy relational dynamics that mirror their own patterns. For example, a therapist with unaddressed issues around control might inadvertently dominate sessions or become overly directive. One with a deep fear of conflict might consistently shy away from challenging a patient appropriately, even when it's needed for growth.
So it contaminates the process.
It contaminates the process. The practical implications are equally profound. Genuine empathy, that complete concentration, that freedom from anxiety and greed, that Fromm champions in the art of listening, these become impossible if the therapist's own perception is clouded by their unaddressed anxieties, unresolved grief, hidden biases, or personal agendas. Self-analysis, for Fromm, isn't a one-time event you complete in training. It's a continuous, lifelong ethical commitment. It's an ongoing process of introspection, seeking feedback, perhaps through supervision or their own therapy, and striving for greater self-awareness to ensure they can remain as clear and authentic an instrument as possible in the therapeutic process. It ensures the focus stays squarely on the patient's journey, not distorted by the therapist's unconscious needs.
This chapter then really powerfully underscores Fromm's core humanistic belief we've seen throughout, that there needs to be a sense of shared vulnerability, a shared humanity between the therapist and the patient. It's not a one-way street where only the patient reveals themselves.
Exactly. It demolishes the image of the therapist as a perfected, unflappable guru.
So how does recognizing and embracing this shared vulnerability actually help the therapeutic process? How does a therapist's own journey, their own struggles and self-awareness influence their capacity to actually help you, the person sitting opposite them?
That's such an insightful question, because it seems counterintuitive, right? Wouldn't you want a therapist who has it all figured out? Fromm argues, and relational psychoanalysis largely agrees, that it's precisely this shared vulnerability, appropriately held and managed, that fosters a deeper level of trust and authenticity in the relationship. And that authenticity is what leads to more profound healing.
How does it build trust?
When a therapist isn't presenting themselves as an impenetrable, perfect authority figure, when they implicitly, or sometimes carefully and explicitly, convey that they too are on a human journey with its own struggles and learning, it creates a powerful sense of shared humanity. It non-verbally signals to the patient, it's okay to be imperfect, it's okay to struggle. Growth is a messy, ongoing process for everyone, including me. It normalizes the difficulty of being human.
It makes the therapist less intimidating, more relatable.
Absolutely. And a therapist's own journey, their capacity, developed through their own self-analysis, to tolerate their own pain, to navigate their own uncertainties, to acknowledge their own limitations and mistakes, to sit with ambiguity, This directly influences their capacity to help others do the same. Their self-awareness allows them to hold space for the patient's intense emotions, their confusion, their vulnerabilities, without being overwhelmed or defensive or needing to quickly fix it because of their own discomfort.
They can handle the heat because they've been in their own fire.
That's a great way to put it. They lead by example, implicitly modeling the courage, the honesty, and the self-compassion required for deep introspection and change. It demonstrates the very process of self-acceptance and growth that therapy aims to facilitate in the patient. It shows, rather than just tells, that vulnerability is strength.
Thinking historically again, this must have been a pretty radical stance in the 1970s, challenging that image of the cool, detached analyst.
Oh, extremely radical in many circles. As we've said, psychoanalysis, despite its internal evolutions, was still largely perceived in the wider culture, and even within parts of the profession, as a clinical, somewhat detached, authoritative field. The analyst was often idealized or feared as this distant, inscrutable, all-knowing figure. Fromm's unwavering insistence on the analyst's fundamental humanity, their fallibility, and their absolute ethical need for ongoing self-analysis was a significant departure from that model.
And it fit with the times.
Perfectly. It aligned beautifully with the broader countercultural push for authenticity, for dismantling rigid hierarchies, for valuing genuine human connection over sterile professionalism, which was so characteristic of the late 60s and 70s. And for Fromm, this wasn't just an abstract philosophical stance. It felt deeply personal, woven into his own life experience.
His background influences again?
Yes. His roots in the Frankfurt School gave him that critical perspective on power dynamics and societal alienation. But also, think about his personal history. Being a German Jew who had to flee the horrors of the Nazi regime in the 1930s, that kind of profound experience inevitably shapes one's views on human nature, on authenticity versus conformity, on survival, on the importance of genuine connection and mutual support in the face of immense societal darkness. These influences likely solidified his conviction that true healing, true sanity, emerges not from detached, objective analysis, but from genuine, vulnerable, authentic human encounter and shared struggle.
And bringing it to 2025, we see a really fascinating and sometimes controversial modern manifestation of this, don't we? Therapists openly sharing their own mental health journeys, often on public platforms like social media.
Yes, it's a remarkable, very contemporary parallel. It's something that would have been almost unthinkable, professionally taboo, just a few decades ago. But now, in 2025, you have licensed therapists, psychologists, counselors posting quite candidly online on platforms like X, formerly Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, blogs about their own experiences with anxiety, depression, trauma, burnout, even sharing insights from their own therapy sessions.
Does this practice align with Fromm's philosophy?
In a fundamental way, yes. It directly echoes Fromm's core philosophy about the importance of the therapist's humanity and authenticity, but adapted for a digital public audience. This practice powerfully normalizes vulnerability. It demystifies therapy and therapists. It reduces stigma by showing that mental health challenges are part of the universal human experience, affecting everyone, including the professionals themselves. It can build immense relatability and trust, potentially encouraging more people, especially younger generations who are active on these platforms, to feel less ashamed and more willing to seek help. It embodies that shared humanity Fromm spoke of.
But are there potential downsides or risks to this level of public vulnerability for therapists?
Oh, absolutely. It's a complex issue with significant ethical considerations. While authenticity is valuable, therapists doing this must exercise careful professional judgment. They need to balance sharing appropriately to normalize struggle and build connection without oversharing in a way that burdens clients or blurs necessary professional boundaries. There's a risk of making it about themselves rather than the shared experience, or shifting the focus from clinical expertise to personal narrative. There's also the challenge of protecting their own privacy and managing how their public persona might impact their therapeutic relationships with individual clients. It requires navigating a fine line between helpful transparency and potentially problematic self-disclosure. Despite these challenges, though, it's undeniably a powerful contemporary expression of Fromm's core belief that the helper's authenticity is absolutely crucial for providing authentic help.
So reflecting on this final chapter, Fromm's analysis really delves deep into the human heart of the therapeutic process itself. It makes the whole endeavor feel much more relatable, more trustworthy for listeners who might see therapists as guides on a shared journey rather than distant, unapproachable gurus.
Exactly. It humanizes the therapist and, by extension, the entire process. And Fromm's candid reflections in these seminars, which are captured so well in the book and presumably the audiobook narration, they inspire a deep trust, Not trust in the therapist's perfection, but trust in the process itself, precisely because it acknowledges and embraces its deeply human foundation. It emphasizes that therapy, at its best, is a journey embarked upon by two fallible but striving human beings working together towards greater understanding, healing, and growth.
What an incredibly powerful and fitting conclusion to Fromm's work, really emphasizing that authenticity and shared humanity are not just nice additions, but are absolutely essential to the art of listening and the process of healing. If this deep dive, and especially this final insight, has resonated with you, please make sure you like this episode, subscribe to Book Podcast Zone for all our upcoming deep dives, and share it to help spread these truly vital insights.
Yes, please do. It's important stuff. Hashtag tag outro.
Wow. What a truly profound journey we've taken today, diving deep into Erich Fromm's The Art of Listening. We've covered so much ground.
We really have. It's such a rich work.
We started by exploring Fromm's foundational idea, the core purpose of psychoanalysis as this timeless quest for self-knowledge, linking it all the way from ancient Greek philosophy right up to your own personal growth today.
Setting the stage.
Then we delved into his courageous, humanistic view of childhood, how he challenged those older, perhaps harsher Freudian notions, and emphasized the environment's impact. And from there, we moved into his crucial distinction between benign and malignant neuroses, a framework that so powerfully shapes realistic therapeutic strategies and expectations.
A very practical distinction.
Definitely. Then we unpacked what Fromm saw as the true drivers of therapeutic change, not just technique, but the transformative power of the authentic, empathetic, therapeutic relationship itself, which led us, naturally, to the absolute heart of the book. Fromm's exquisite and deeply practical exploration of the art of listening, with that beautiful poetry analogy and his 6 vital rules.
Rules for life, really.
Truly. Then we saw how he reframed those core psychoanalytic concepts, dreams, resistance, transference, viewing them through his unique humanistic relational lens, emphasizing mutuality and understanding. And finally, we closed with his essential, culminating insight. The absolute necessity of the analyst embracing their own humanity, engaging in continuous self-analysis, and fostering shared vulnerability.
It's remarkable how cohesive his vision is across all these different facets. From Fromm's enduring legacy on both psychoanalysis and the broader field of humanistic psychology is just immense. His work continues, decades later, to shape how we understand mental health, how we think about relationships, and really what it means to be fully human in an often challenging and complex world.
He offers such a hopeful perspective.
He does. He consistently advocated for a therapy, and really a way of living that isn't just about getting rid of symptoms or adjusting to society's demands, but about fostering genuine self-realization, authentic connection with others, and a deep, compassionate understanding of the human condition. He reminds us again and again that at the very heart of psychological healing lies profound empathy, the courage to truly know ourselves, and the courage to truly encounter another human being. That therapeutic encounter, for Fromm, is a profound human encounter.
So, as we close out this deep dive, here's a final thought for you to perhaps ponder, sparked by Fromm's wisdom. Considering his powerful emphasis on deep, empathetic listening, on authentic connection, on being fully present. In our world today, a world increasingly dominated by speed, by quick interactions, by digital communication, by curated online personas, and often by quite superficial connections. What might be the biggest challenge and perhaps also the greatest opportunity for you to cultivate this art of listening in your own life right now?
That's a great question to leave people with.
Something to mull over. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into Erich Fromm's The Art of Listening.
It's been a real pleasure exploring it with you all.
Remember to like this deep dive if you found it valuable, subscribe to Book Podcast Zone for more, and share it with others. Keep an eye out for our next deep dive. Thanks for listening.